Kepada para peserta, apabila ada bangku kosong di sebelahnya mohon untuk bergeser ya, dan supaya kalau ada yang datang mudah aksesnya. Silakan kalau ada bangku yang kosong untuk bergeser dan memenuhi tempat yang ada. Jika ada dosen atau karyawan yang datang dan presenter dari luar yang datang, mohon untuk kepada mahasiswa mengalah ya, berdiri dan nanti akan duduk di pinggir, nggak apa-apa. Jadi mohon mengutamakan tamu yang dari luar, dosen dan karyawan yang memang peserta Aicollim.
of Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim. Assalamualaikum. It is known as Wonderland Indonesia Dance.
في ركرة من المحاضرات والطالبات في كلية العلوم الإنسانية.
Applause for Sri Kandi.
Indonesia is the most beautiful land in the universe. The land where we were born, the nation where we grew up. So many colors that live together in peace, with a million timeless treasures, with an abundance of natural wealth. Indonesia is not just wonderful. Indonesia is a wonderland.
Tepuk tangan yang meriah. Perlu diketahui Bapak Ibu sekalian, penari adalah para dosen dan karyawan serta mahasiswa Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang.
Give applause for Sri Kandi. Thank you for the acclamation from Sri Kandi Group. Next, allow me Hajida Zahwa Sadika.
وأنا ربيعة محمودة كرئيسة الجلسة في هذه المناسبة لنرحبكم ونكبركم ونسلم عليكم.
The Honorable Professor Dr. Hilge Dinail from Leuven, Belgium. The Honorable Doug Inferson, PhD from University of Nottingham, Malaysia. The Honorable Professor Dr. Muhammad Al-Sayed Sulaiman A from UIN Shams University. The Honorable Doan Omran, PhD from the University of New Mexico, USA.
Sumul Fadilah Profesor Inyuman Dharma Putra min Jami'ah Udayana Al-Indonesia. Ad-Duktur Ji Haryat Moko SG min Jami'ah Sanata Dharma Indonesia. Profesor Wildana Warga Dinata wa Murasyah Profesor Istiada Al-Magistir min Jami'ah Maulana Malik Ibrahim Al-Islamiyah Al-Hukumiyah Malang.
The Honorable Rector of Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang, Profesor Dr. Muhammad Zainuddin MA. The Honorable Vice Rector of Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang.
Fadilah Amidi Kulliyatil Ulum Al-Insaniyah Ad-Duktur Muhammad Faisal. Al-Mukarram Jami'un Wabi Amid wa Ru'usail Aqsamil Kulliyatil Ulum Al-Insaniyah.
Respectfully, all of the academic community of Humanities faculty and all the blessed audience.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahilladzi kana bi'ibadihi khabiran basira. Tabarakalladzi ja'ala fis sama'i burujan wa ja'ala fiha sirajan wa qamaran munira. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wa asyhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh alladzi ba'athahu bil haqqi basyiran wa nadhira.
By grateful and salam, let us follow together the opening of the 4th Annual International Conference on Language and Media.
أيها الحاضرون الأعزاء، قبل أن نبدأ هذا البرنامج فاسمحوا لنا أن نقرأ لكم تنظيم البرنامج في هذه الفرصة السعيدة.
First, speech by the Holy Al-Quran.
ثانيا، كلمة مدير الجامعة.
Next, the performance of Gita Swara Maliki Choir.
البرنامج الآخر الاختتام والدعاء.
Alright, let us directly follow the first event, reciting the Holy Al-Quran. To Suci Reskika, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A'udzu billahi minasy syaithanir rajim. Inna fi khalqis samawati wal ardi wa ikhtilafil laili wan nahar واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار صدق الله العظيم. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sadaqallahul azim wa nahnu ala dhalika minasyahidin. Ayyuhal hadirun as-su'ada wal barnamij tali huwa kalimatut tarhibiyah min mudiri Jami'ah Maulana Malik Ibrahim Al-Islamiyah Al-Hukumiyah Malang Fadila Profesor Ad-Doktor Muhammad Zainuddin wa yastamirru biftitahil mu'tamar wa li siyadatihi mashkuran.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Muhammadin Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa mawala amma ba'du. The Honorable Dean of Humanities Faculty, Dr. Faisal Fatawi, and his Vice Dean from Belgium, Dag Yngvesson, PhD from Malaysia, Doan Omran, PhD from Mexico, Prof. Dr. M. Said Sulaiman from Egypt, Profesor Inyuman Dharma Putra, Indonesia, Dr. G. Haryatmoko SC from Indonesia, Profesor Dr. Wildana Margadinata from Malang, Indonesia, and Dr. Istiaza MA from Malang, Indonesia too. the organizing committee, presenters, and participants. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is my pleasure to attend the Faculty of Humanities 4th Annual Conference on Language, Literature, and Media on title Humanities in Diverse Contexts, discuss humanities from diverse perspective to capture the dynamic and complex nature from the areas, as shown in the theme and sub-themes on the conference today. For example, the issues of eco-linguistics, digital linguistics, digital literature, and politics in the Arab world, and so on. Discussing all these updates in the field, I believe will enrich how we redefine and construct new meaning of linguistics, literature, and media in today's modern and postmodern world. This kind of event is one of the crucial programs of the Faculty of Humanities and also this university, State Islamic University of MAULANA MALIK IBRAHIM MALANG, or UIN Malik IBRAHIM MALANG, both in USA and Malaysia, are the sign that our university is one of the hubs of this global and update conversation in this exciting field. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, of course, I say to thank you very much for all of you, and let's officially open this international conference by recite Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And I expect that you all gain a lot from this event. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Move on to the next agenda. That is the performance of the lecturer and staff of Universitas Islam Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang. Please welcome Kita Suara Maliki Choir.
Perlu diketahui Bapak Ibu sekalian, Gita Suara Maliki Choir adalah grup paduan suara yang terdiri dari para dosen dan karyawan yang bekerja di lintas fakultas di Universitas Islam Negeri Maulana Malik Ibrahim Malang. Dan hari ini, sambil menunggu beliau mengatur posisi, hari ini adalah debut pertama untuk Gita Suara Maliki Choir. Dengan Coach Ahmad Muzaki Afifuddin, mohon maaf, Bapak Muzaki Afifuddin coachnya, dan pianis kita adalah Ivan Satya. Silakan. Tepuk tangan yang meriah.
Konduktor saat ini adalah Ganis Chandra, dosen ilmu perpustakaan. Tepuk tangan yang meriah.
أيها السادة الكرماء، وصلنا إلى البرنامج الأخير وهو الدعاء والاختتام الذي سيلقيه فضيلة الدكتور حليمي، فليتفضل سيادته مشكورا.
Acara Aicollim yang dibuka tadi oleh Bapak Rektor berjalan dengan lancar 2 hari ini, dan insya Allah nanti bisa diikuti oleh seluruh fakultas di UIN Malang dan juga seluruh akademika di dunia, karena selain Zoom nanti jika kita online. Al-Fatihah. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Maliki yaumiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافي مزيده. يا ربنا دعوتك ربنا ومن لنا سواك، فيا رب حقق دعاء من دعاك. دعوتك يا ربنا والقلب في فرحة علاك، يناجيك يا خالقنا في علاك، بحالنا ونور الحجاب ضحاك. ورأيتك ربنا في كل شيء فزاد اليقين بقلب رآك. وفي زرع بقلب رآك بضائع صنئك بعد نداك. يا ربي جبالا وأنت رفعت السماك، لك الحمد في كل طلعة صبح ونور بدر لي ولنا في سماك. وكليتنا هذه بقربك دعاءنا وبقربكنا لقاءك في هذه الدنيا وفي جنتك لقاءك يا ربنا. اللهم قربنا يا ربنا طلابنا وأساتذنا بك ونلتقي في جنتك يا ربنا. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة.
Amin amin ya rabbal alamin.
That's all the sequence of the opening of the fourth annual International Conference on Language, Literature and Media has done. Next, let us follow the first plenary session that will be guided by Dr. Mundi Rahayu as a moderator.
لقد انتهينا في هذا البرنامج. نقول جزيلة الشكر على جميع الحاضرين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Oh ya, boleh. Yang menari boleh ya. Oke. Awas bulunya mengganggu ya. Boleh duduk. Nah, oke, duduk serius. Silahkan diseling-seling boleh ibu-ibu boleh. Boleh di depan ibu-ibu ya. Duduk di depan. Sini masih kosong bisa? Mbak Ana sini bisa Mbak Ana? Mbak Ima sini bisa Mbak Ime? Sini. Oke. Tambah lagi di bawah satu, oke. Ya, Mas Keli mungkin maju, oke. Ivan kelihatan ya, oke. Siap-siap ya ibu-ibu, bapak-bapak semuanya, kita hitung ya. Enggak apa-apa. Ivan di sini Ivan, sorry Ivan, di sampingnya Coach Kiki. Oke, kita hitung ya semuanya ya. 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke, gaya bebas ya. Begini, Pak Rektor mencontohkan sudah, oke. Bu Begum, oke. Oke, begini Bu, mengepalkan tangan ya. Oke, 1, Pak Rektor. Cukup semanun Prof.
wabarakatuh. Good morning, and for Dr. Doan Omran. Sorry for checking the. Sorry. Suaranya sudah masuk kah di Zoom? Once again, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning for the, and I would welcome Dr. Doan Omran. Hello, Dr. Doan.
Hai, Assalamualaikum.
Good evening, Dr. Doan. Hello, good morning, good evening, Doan Omran. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the experience in this conference. So, before we go to the material for Dr. Doan Omran, so I would like to introduce you all to our speaker, Dr. Doan Omran. Dr. Doan Omran is an adjunct faculty and research fellow at the Department of English, University of New Mexico, United States of America. So, University of New Mexico is in the United States of America, not in Mexico. And then, she's also an adjunct faculty at Central New Mexico Community College since 2020 and up to now. And she's also the member of MLA Elections Committee. She's also got so many awards from her study in dissertation award, in a thesis award, and many others. Okay, and then and her MA is in comparative literature, University of New Mexico in 2012. And her preliminary master's in English literature in Alexandria University, Egypt. And her Bachelor of Arts in English literature, Alexandria University, Egypt in 2003. Okay, there are so many publications that have been published, written and published by Dr. Doan Omran, but I could not read it all right now because it is too long. And before we continue to the presentation from Dr. Doan Omran, I would like to ask permission for Dr. Doan Omran to make it live streaming in YouTube. Is that okay for you?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. We are very grateful. Now, going to talk about the Muslim woman writer's voice across the world. So time is yours now.
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Doan Omran.
Can I share my screen? Yeah, okay. So I have permission to share my screen. Yeah. So much for inviting me. And the first I would say رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف المرسلين. So I'll start my talk today. Can you all hear me well? I hope you can. I'll start my... Okay, you can hear me, okay. So I'm gonna talk about Muslim women's writers' voice from across the world, but I'll be focusing on the Middle East and South Asia and Southeast Asia, because I co-edited these two books in addition to Firoza Jaswala, who's also attending the talk today. She's my co-editor, and she was on my dissertation committee, Literature Association, where we had a panel on Muslim women writers, and we started getting lots of abstracts, too much to include. The first volume included the Middle East, the Arab world, in addition to Iran and Turkey and Kazakhstan, and that came out in March 2021. Our second volume came out in July 2022. That was like a couple of months ago. And that second volume focused on Muslim women's second book. To give you an idea what our chapters were about. So actually, very little scholarship would do South Asia and Southeast Asia together in one volume, but we thought, so we have a section on India, a section on Kashmir, section on Pakistan and Afghanistan in the book, Asia. And we have in that section like 4 chapters, yeah? And then it works from different parts of the world and in that context. So let me just like share the PowerPoint here again. So for example, we had a chapter written by, in this co-edited book by Lynn Iffa, Nafatu Fina, and UIN. And in this chapter, they talk about life activism, authors Lealis, Marcos, and Noor Rofia. And they illustrate how these Muslim cultures. So in most feminist scholarship, you would, on YouTube, like if we start looking at Surah Al-Ma'idah and Surah Al-Nisa, and this book, Women Around the Prophet, Nisa Hawla Rasul, you'll find like that early Muslim women colonization happens, creating modes of non-Islamic modes in their cultures. Yeah, and like with the British fleet and the Spanish Armada invading the world since the 16th century, and of European empires into Africa during the age of imperialism, it's referred to as a scramble due to the way in which you agree that the scramble, the second of Belgium. But also we can take into consideration the British and the French colonizations of the region. For example, the French campaign in Egypt and Syria lasted for 3 years between 1798, Dutch, and the period 7. And like if you look at Egypt, it's here. And what happened to women? Women did experience this colonization. And sometimes actually British women, such as Sophia Poole, would invade the harem or visit the harem dressed like Eastern women or Muslim women, and they would start writing about how these women lived, these Muslim women lived in their countries. So Sophia Poole came from England, and she was the sister of the renowned Orientalist Edward William Lane. Edward William Lane wrote Manners, Customs of Modern Egyptians, but that was in the 19th century. But he couldn't write about the women because he couldn't visit the harem or the women's quarters. So what did he do? He asked his sister to go befriend the women in the harem and start talking about them. And she produces that in what we know today as her letters. And there's a book edited by a professor of mine, may he rest in peace, Dr. Azza Karara, and she did edit her letters into that book. So what we find here as a result of colonization, Muslim women and European women did meet each other in what Marie-Louise Pratt calls the contact zone. And contact zones, according to Pratt, are social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or join what is right, and tanhuna anil munkar, and forbid what's wrong, and believe in God. So how can we consider Muslim women or women from the global South as subaltern if the Quran says otherwise? And it's not just the Quran, let's also look at their personal life. Describing Muslim women as subaltern doesn't necessarily reflect the self-view of Muslims. So even if the West wants to view Muslims or Muslim women as inferior, this is not how Muslim women necessarily view themselves. Even though the imposed term subaltern in post-colonial theory has found approbation in Indian and Western academic circles, it's a demeaning expression that subordinates more than half of the inhabitants of the world. Moreover, subaltern also fixates the previously colonized nations to the strains of the colonial phrase and denies possibilities of psychological liberation and healing from traumas caused by the atrocities committed by the British imperialists. I'm not sure how you view the idea of belonging to the Commonwealth that was like heralded during the Queen Elizabeth II funeral in the past few days. And like that made me have lots of thoughts about the issue. And I think like as Muslims, we need to eliminate negative thinking and think of this book. And because as the title of this book suggests, How to Overcome Negativity Control, May 2020. And, you know, just like using the term subaltern all the time, does it really help? Or shall we focus on other fields of literature? Another aspect that I talk also, in another paper, I talk about the woman from Tantura, and just like to give you an idea, the novel takes place in Palestine after the Nakba, or the 1948 catastrophe / Nakba that happened to the Palestinians. And it's a book that I contributed a chapter to that came out last month. And in that book, my chapter was titled The Woman from Tantura, an auto-theoretical reading in the art of resistance. So auto-theory, what is auto-theory? Because I'm talking in this paper, this book chapter about the auto-theory. So auto-theory has only been applied to Western non-fictive autobiographies to date, and the Arabic experience has not been given required attention. The purpose of this chapter, my chapter, is also to venture into the necessary yet unprecedented attempt of reading Palestinian writing through an autobiographical lens. I argue that when women write histories that can be easily obliterated due to occupation, fictional, auto-theoretical writings become a tool not only survival. Among the theorists who talked about auto-theory is Stacey Young, who talked about it in her Changing the World or Word, Discourse, Politics, and the Feminist Movement. The book came out in 1997, and she talks about how academics intersperse reflections of theory in their intellectual work. And you see the exact thing happening in the Arabic novel, The Woman from Tantura, because the writer was actually a professor in Cairo University, and she's applying a lot of post-colonial theory to the Palestinian experience and the occupation of Palestine. And this is what I'm illustrating in my chapter. Yeah, another writer also who talked about auto theory was introduced by Lauren. For the book actually just came out in 2021, but I'm using the theory in that book to also prove that, I'm quoting her here, master discourses are fused with self-reflection and self-representation, and that auto theory transforms existing colonial discourses of philosophy and theory, interweaving the personal with the critical. So actually, so if you look at a lot of Muslim women writers nowadays, most of them, or a considerable amount of them, have read theory. They are university professors, and they are doing what they're reading in theory and applying that to their creative writings. So let me go back to so I already talked about the second book. Let me talk a little bit about our first book, which came out in March 2021. And this book focuses on the Middle East. And we conceive this volume as a space, or our scholarship in general, to showcase lesser known Muslim writers to the West. We understand, me and my co-editor, and acknowledge that several scholars like Latifa Zayat, Ferial Ghazzoul are widely known, but we also wanted to give lesser known scholars from the Middle East and the chance to showcase their scholarship. We invited the writers, chapters on more modern writers, such as Tamara Shalabi, who's from Iraq, Ibtisam Shakouch from Syria, writes about refugees in Syrian camps. Alexandra Shrita teaches here in North America, and she's also a creative writer. And some of the scholarship was on works translated into English, and other works have not been translated yet. One of the tropes that our scholarship deals with is women, is the Shahrazad trope. So women from the Middle East have been telling and writing stories and recalling memories conveyed orally. Since the days of the mythic Shahrazad, caravans of women moving along the desert lines told each other stories and created tales didactic, fantastic, perhaps cautionary, thus inspiring the creation of this legend named Shahrazad groups women together. So groups of women probably told each other either grandmother tales or vividly imagined tales of female strength and heroism. So that's why we have actually a section in our first book on the Shahrazad trope, and that's the last section of the book. The book also includes other chapters, such as the female poets from Kazakhstan. The book starts with the earliest feminists in the Middle East or in Egypt, and that includes Latifa Zayat and Utul Ulub al-Dimardashiyya, who were 19th century writers, maybe early 20th century writers too. They existed in both centuries. We also have in the first volume cross-cultural conversations and memories. We have writers, we included writers from Iraq and Azar Nafisi from Iran. We also included women writers, Muslim women writers in the diaspora or from the diaspora, and these include Mohja Kahf, who wrote The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf, and she's the lady wearing the white and red scarf to your left. Laila Abu Leila in the blue hat scarf, and she's a writer from Sudan, and she wrote Distant View, Minaret, sorry. and Laila Lalami, who is Moroccan writer who teaches in the US, and she's also a creative writer. She's a university professor and a creative writer. We also have a chapter in our first volume on Saad al-Sabah, who is a Kuwaiti princess, and she's also a poet. We have also chapters on Ibtisam Shakouch, the Syrian writer who I told you, right, about the Syrian refugees, and Tamara Rifai, and both of these writers from Syria write about the Syrian refugee crisis and the diaspora of the Syrians nowadays. We also have a chapter on Asya Jabbar, and Asya Jabbar is one of these writers that our book focuses on, because we actually have 2 chapters on Jabbar in that book, because she talks about Shahrazad or the Shahrazad trope extensively in her works. My co-editor, Professor Jaswala, also had a chapter on Iranian women writing the refugee experience or Iranian women leaving Iran and living abroad. My chapter in that book, also I have a chapter in the first volume on Ramza, which is a novel by Utul Ulub al-Dimardashaya, and that novel was first published in 1958, and my chapter was titled Muslim Face, White Mask, Utul Ulub al-Dimardashaya Ramza as a mimic Muslim woman. And in my chapter, I focus on Muslim women who try to imitate the West in order to be modernized. And in that novel, the protagonist is brought up by a French governess, and although throughout the novel, Ramza is trying to imitate the governess, to be European, she somehow looks down upon her own cultural roots. You find her having this conflict happening throughout. So as I said, the novel she writes in French. The novel appeared in translation, and the Arabic translation appeared later on. The Dean of Arabic Literature, Taha Hussein, actually criticized women writing in French and thought that Muslim women should be, or Arabs should be writing in Arabic, which is our original language. And he said that we shouldn't read the novel in French and then get it translated into Arabic. She should have introduced it to her audience in Arabic first. And then one of the theoretical frameworks I used in my work was Homi Bhabha. And Homi Bhabha actually uses the term mimicry, which he adapts from Naipaul's Mimic Man. And I use it in my paper for the mimic woman who is Muslim. And Homi Bhabha talks about that in his Location of Culture. And he elaborates on the idea of the colonized imitating the colonizer. Bhabha says mimicry, quote, mimicry emerges as one of the most elusive and effective strategies of colonial power and knowledge, unquote. However, Homi Bhabha does quote Ibn Khaldun in the beginning of his book, but even before Homi Bhabha talks about mimicry, Ibn Khaldun talks about it in his Muqaddimah, which is a medieval text that came out in 1377. And in the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun says, the vanquished always wants to imitate the victor in his distinctive characteristics, his dress, his occupation, and all his other conditions and customs. Ibn Khaldun attributes this superficial imitation to the fact that the superiority of the victor is not the result of his group feeling or great fortitude, but of his customs and manners. So, unfortunately, we can see this happening in the writings of some Muslim women because many people nowadays have identity crisis, especially with all the conflicts happening in the Muslim world nowadays. Also, the idea of mimicry, we can see it in Frantz Fanon's Black Faces, White Masks, which came out in 1952. Frantz Fanon states in his book that every colonized people have an inferiority complex that has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation that is with the culture of the mother country or the colonizing country. Don't want to go over my time, so I'll conclude with this phrase which we have in Arabic, عقدة الخواجة, or the foreigners complex. عقدة الخواجة, the خواجة is the European foreigner, عقدة is complex. In simple English, it's xenophilia, and it specifically refers to the European foreigner. الخواجة refers to the European foreigner, as I said, and the idiom is widely used to mockingly describe an Egyptian or an Arab person who imitates the Europeans in order to put an act of equally being superior. In conclusion, a fine tricky line between learning from the colonizer and mimicking them. I'll conclude with this verse from the Quran. يا أيها الناس إن خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. So people have created us from male and female, made us into races so that we may come to know each other. So my question for you that I want to conclude with, what constitutes this thin line between learning from all the rich cultures in the world and mimicking and just trying to imitate them without returning to our original roots? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's give applause to Dr. Doan Omran, who have given us the very enlightening ideas and so many references of her publications as well. Well, for those who have the questions or comments or anything you want to say to Dr. Doan Omran, please keep it, or you may write down in the chat box for you in the Zoom. But for you in this room, so we have to keep your questions. We will go to the second presenters today. The second presenter is Mr. Doug Inferson. Hello, Mr. Doug. Could you unmute, please? The operator, please. Tolong di unmute untuk. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Hello.
Excellent.
Good morning, Mas.
Good morning.
Okay. Thank you. It's still morning, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Saya tidak begitu jauh, hanya di Malaysia, bukan di Amerika.
Okay, yes, right. Thank you. Before we go to the presentation from Dr. Doug Inferson, I would like to introduce you all to the presenter. Dr. Doug Inferson is assistant professor in Assistant Professor of Film and Cultural Studies of University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus, and he is now the head of Film and Television Studies since 2019. From 2000 up to now, he becomes the independent contractor or freelance film producer, director, cinematographer, and editor. One of his film is banyak ayam banyak rezeki atau banyak anak banyak rezeki.
Banyak ayam kalau film saya.
Banyak ayam banyak rezeki. That's a very phenomenal film. And his dissertation title is Non-Aligned Features, the Coincidence of Modernity and the Screen in Indonesia. So he has done a lot of research in Indonesia, especially about the screen culture, and made many films also in Indonesia. Now we come to the presentation, and time for Mr. Doug. Okay, time is yours now.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Hopefully you can see that. Let me just adjust this so I can see better. Okay. Okay. So, my talk is titled Showing the Unseen, Meditation on Aesthetic Logic and Politics in Java. Coincidentally, it will actually also touch on certain issues of imitation or not imitation in the realm of cinema. But I'm going to begin by talking about something that is not all that often related to cinema or normally related to cinema, but I'm trying to make a connection between these two things. And minta maaf sebelumnya karena saya akan bicarakan hal-hal yang bisa dianggap sirik tergantung perspektif orangnya, tapi memang hal-hal ini ada dan menurut saya patut diinvestigasi, dipikirkan supaya kita lebih mengerti tujuannya, maknanya, dan lain-lain konteksnya. Okay, I'll go back to English. And I'm going to talk about something that's quite close to home in East Java for you all who are there in Malang. So this paper analyzes aesthetic strategies and the politics they express, comparing ideas of naturalism versus obvious construction, theatricality, or fakeness in both film form and the practices of dukun. So in 2015, at a family gathering in Sidoarjo, I was introduced to a dukun called Mas Dadang. Mas Dadang was in his late 30s at the time, and his spiky hair, slim-fitting jeans, and Manchester United jersey were at odds with the robed, gray-bearded stereotype of dukuns that is often featured in films, a look that is also adopted by some actual dukuns. For those around him, however, Dadang's appearance did not seem to read as inauthentic or to conflict with the nature of his practice. I became interested in Dadang in part because of his philosophy of the world as made up of the seen and the unseen, which he calls dunia terbuat dari yang ketok dan tak ketok. I was especially intrigued by his interest in the causal force of the unseen, a conglomeration he describes alternately as God, Allah Tuhan Sang Pencipta, or the unconscious, alam di bawah sadar. Although it is invisible to most people, the unseen coexists with and influences the visible world. Through meditation and study, Dadang explained, he has learned to create an entrance into what lies beyond the seen, a process that he calls nyobek tabir, or tearing the veil of the visible. Our discussion took place in a small pendopo pavilion adjacent to his house, where Dadang holds well-attended weekly sessions teaching his philosophy and techniques to children. We sat cross-legged on the floor with a group of his friends and relatives who had come to listen in. As he explained the concept of tearing open the visible, the others urged him to provide a demonstration of what he means. Still sitting beside me, Mas Dadang quickly raised his hands above his head, clapping them and pressing them together like this, exclaiming wujud, which means materialize, as most of you know. And then following a series of jerky movements where his hands were brought down in front of his torso and clapped together again, Dadang slowly then opened his right hand and extended it in my direction, and in it was a small purple stone, which I later had made into a ring. And he gave it to me. What was clearest about the transaction is that Dadang had brought forth the stone from a place that was invisible to everyone present, and had done so using a series of repetitive movements that gave the impression of being a formalized technique. In other words, these things, right? Like most techniques, the eye-catching jerkiness of Dadang's way of showing that he's moving something from the unseen to the visible appeared to carry its own implicit messages. Despite his unstereotypical clothes, for example, Dadang's movements show that he does also present himself in ways that more closely resemble typical Javanese, Indonesian, or Southeast Asian signifiers of spiritual power or magic. And as I'm sure many of you have also experienced, as I have over the last 2 decades, I've seen similar techniques deployed by numerous other dukun in and around Central and East Java. Rather than smoothly rendering his actions in the logical terms of the visual and the material, by taking the stone from his pocket, for instance, which would make more sort of sense with the way we normally understand the world working, Mas Dadang seemed to be underscoring a distinction from the consistency and seamlessness of reality as we experience it under most circumstances. For an observer attempting to determine whether practitioners like Dadang are capable of actual magic, his technique might seem too obvious or brash. It could certainly be read as a use of sleight of hand to trick or distract the eyes of viewers, creating the appearance, a false appearance, of the stone's manifestation as if from nothing. And, you know, if you look around in Indonesian media, you will also see that the same or similar looks and movements and, you know, sort of self-presentations that are used to authenticate dukun are sometimes also used to point at them as fake, or, you know, not actually doing what they say, not actually able to contact the unseen or spirits, etc. So there's a fine line here in how you sort of play with these things and present yourself, and to whom. I think the audience and how they see these things is also important. Even if one doesn't think it's a trick, one might wonder why the technique is used to make the stone appear, or if there is some additional purpose attached to the technique. At any rate, in the context in which it occurred, Dadang's performative flourishes did not appear to undermine his onlookers' acceptance that the stone originated from an unseen dimension. Looking at the event more broadly, whether the stone had in fact appeared through some kind of magic was probably among the least important aspects of what I had just seen. As Dadang's movements already began to suggest, the stone's power, and indeed its market value, are entangled with a complex set of social and economic factors, many of which are in fact abstract and not directly visible. Because the stone is a gem, or batu ake, for example, many people would already see it as potentially holding special or supernatural properties. While not everyone necessarily believes this or understands it in exactly the same way, batu ake have long been sought after as charms that enhance the abilities or charisma of those who possess or wear them. At the time, batu ake, this was in 2015, batu ake were also part of an especially fervent nationwide trend, which I'm sure many of you remember, when there were stands and people selling batu ake everywhere you looked, on pretty much every street in most of Indonesia. It's calmed down a bit now. But of course, it's a long-standing trend that just sort of hit a particularly hot point back then. In addition to this, stones that have been discovered by someone like Dadang and are thus imbued with the aura of the unseen are particularly sought after and can fetch prices upwards of tens or even hundreds of millions of rupiah. Unlike some dukun, however, Dadang forbids the objects he acquires from the unseen to be sold or traded. Perhaps for him, the unseen values and logic attached to the stones are at odds with the rules and market forces driving the visible world. His use of unnatural-looking formal techniques to bring forth the stone would seem to underscore this distinction. One way of looking at the function or message behind his technique, then, is that the arrival of an object from an unseen space should not invoke the realistic terms of the visible world. If the logic and physics of the unseen are in fact different, making the passage look normal might well raise suspicions as to the authenticity of both process and object. Realism or naturalism in this case would paradoxically give the impression of fakery. For those who do believe in, or at least accept Dadang's interpretation of formal dramatization of the intersection of two distinct planes, two distinct spaces, the unseen and the visible world, his techniques have important consequences for how the visible material world is understood as such. If something that looks false or alien actually signifies a kind of authenticity, then perhaps the visible world is more complex than it seems, and perhaps it cannot be understood to be whole or continuous as such. Instead, as Dadang's technique seem to imply, the visible world contains normally unperceived holes or gateways that lead to other dimensions, places with the potential to influence lived reality. If this is starting to sound like something from a movie, perhaps that is appropriate. Dadang's manipulation of the visual logics of appearance and disappearance is not all that different from how filmmakers and other artists use formal techniques to show, hide, and suggest the existence of things that we can't see. In the terms of film studies, we could say that Dadang is violating the rules of classical Hollywood continuity by making the space around him seem discontinuous and challenging to understand. The classical system of representation developed in the American film industry is premised on naturalism and works to create a world on screen that recognizably follows the visual, spatial, and temporal logics of how we normally experience the world we live in. Time generally moves forward in a clear and consistent manner, and spaces appear continuous and whole. Even when ghosts, aliens, or beings from other dimensions enter the screen, they are generally rendered in the same classical visual logic, so that Hollywood's audiences won't be confused by them or perceive them as fake. Because of America's particularly prominent role as an imperialist power throughout much of the 20th century, and because of the related export of Hollywood aesthetics around the world, many politicized oppositional film movements in South America, Africa, Europe, and in fact in the US itself, purposely broke and challenged the rules of cinema as established by Hollywood. One of the things that interests me about film history in Indonesia and much of Southeast Asia is that the frequent lack of adherence to classical continuity is almost never framed as an oppositional strategy, primarily aimed at attacking the influence of Hollywood. There have, of course, been left-wing movements in Indonesia, mainly from the late 1950s to the mid-1960s, that were premised on opposing mainstream American aesthetics. Unfortunately, however, most of the films produced by these movements were destroyed, as many of you probably know, during the rise of the New Order in 1965 to 1966. So it's very difficult to study them and compare them to non-leftist aesthetics in terms of how they resist or don't resist Hollywood, unfortunately. Even outside of these films, however, Hollywood aesthetics were never as dominant in Indonesia as they were elsewhere in the global South. As in much of Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s, films made by Indonesians were shown in different theaters than Hollywood films. They therefore competed mainly with other Southeast Asian movies that circulated around lower-cost screens throughout the region, while Hollywood played to affluent urban audiences in so-called A-class cinemas. Cinemas for local films and their spectators had their own established visual conventions and techniques, many of which were at odds with the supposedly universal rules set by Hollywood. But whether or not they were breaking Hollywood's rules was less important because most of the audiences for these films didn't go to see imported movies. Or the imported movies they saw mainly came from Southeast Asia and elsewhere in Asia. Hollywood tropes and genres were still often appropriated and referenced in regional films, but were mixed in with local techniques or those of Indian and other Asian cinemas in a way that minimized and marginalized the direct influence of Hollywood. To return to Dadang's challenges to normative perception, I'm interested in how techniques in classic Indonesian films can be read in a way that relates to the performativity of Dadang and other dukuns. Can films that mix distinct visual logics be seen not as making mistakes or as attacking the global hegemony of Hollywood per se, but potentially as working to authenticate the appearance of objects or agents from unseen spaces that intersect with the visible world. In my understanding, furthermore, the absence of intent to oppose Hollywood does not mean that these films' techniques and strategies aren't political. Embedded in dynamic local and regional aesthetic spheres, the techniques can also be used as tools to intervene in subnational, national, or regional political debates. Not surprisingly, for those of you who are familiar with Indonesian film history, the group of local films most famous for stretching and distorting the visual logic of both Hollywood and the material world are those dealing with mysticism. A particularly good example is 1979's Ratu Ilmu Hitam, directed by Lilik Sudio and starring, you guessed it, Susanna as the eponymous queen. I will start with a clip from the opening of the film. It begins to give an idea of how things that are made. Here we go. It begins to give an idea of how things that are made unnatural in appearance and movement can signify something much more complex and interesting than mere fakeness or typical third world oppositionality. As you can see, the film opens with a wedding. The daughter of the Lura in a village that I assume is in East Java because of the Reok performance is marrying a young man named Kohar from the same village. Things are complicated by the fact that he has previously had a relationship with Susanna's character, Murni. Oops. Sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. Let me go back down. Okay, go back here. Okay.
Tapi kan ganteng, rayuannya mau.
Sorry, this is lost my place a little. There we go. Okay, so Susanna's character has had a problem with the guy Kohar's getting married, promising to marry her. In the past, he took her virginity, but then left her for the opportunity of marrying into the Lura's family. Very quickly, things start to go wrong at the wedding, beginning when the bride is suddenly able to see things that no one else sees. Like this. Now, here's where I start to think about the mixing of visual logics. These things are rendered as a puppet-like skeleton and some rather unconvincing monsters, which the film inserts in an obvious way using dissolved transitions that call attention to the edit. You can also see it's in a different space. It has a different lighting, so it's not made to look like it smoothly goes into the world of the film. In the context of Reok performance as well, where people who are wearing simple wooden masks are understood to become possessed by spirits, really. However, the fakeness of the masks and the overt theatricality of the dancers' movements enhances the authenticity of the experience. And this is also included in the scene, right? So why then shouldn't the monsters appear to the bride in a similarly constructed manner? Filmmaking across Southeast Asia is heavily influenced by other popular arts that have always rejected the importance of naturalism. Soon after Ratu Ilmu Hitam's first visual break, the entire party goes into trance, as you can see here, losing control of their bodies. A pawang hujan who has failed to stop the impending rain is then lifted off the ground by unseen forces. Here the film creates a visual fuss around the trick, with another actor running underneath him several times as if to prove it's real, but in fact calling attention to the film's construction of the event. This is played for comedic effect, introducing a different tone and genre into what is otherwise billed as horror. Especially in light of the Piala Chitras the film has received for cinematography and editing, neither the deconstruction of the trick nor the diffusing of the scene's scariness with something absurd and funny seem to have taken away from the effectiveness of the scene. After the wedding, Murni is accused by Kohar of causing the disturbance with black magic. Using his newfound influence, Kohar gathers a mob of villagers together, and at his behest, they drag Murni from her home and throw her off a cliff, accusing her of being a witch. Unbeknownst to them, however, she is caught and saved from death by a dukun who happens to be standing at the bottom of the cliff and who takes her under his wing. Despite her hesitation at first, he pushes her to take revenge on her attackers, pledging to teach her black magic with which to terrorize and strike back at them. And this is what we start to see in this clip. This clip shows something much more similar to what I witnessed with Mas Dadang, which is a formal theatrical hand movement that is combined with revealing something realistic in the hand, in this case bees. The rest of the scene proceeds more naturalistically, using real bees attaching themselves to the actor's face and without quite so many camera or edit techniques to call attention to themselves. Okay. And I'm going to move on to the next clip, so we don't use up too much time. Here we begin to see a local visual aesthetic politics emerge more clearly. The typical New Order trope of the rationalist Kiai who comes in from outside to solve the spiritual problems of villagers is clearly invoked. The contrast between his slow, dispassionate, and seemingly natural movements with the exaggerated theatricality that we'll see in a minute of the Dukun is also striking and sets up an aestheticized contest between two opposing sides and styles of movements.
Lebih baik cepat-cepat tinggalkan tempat ini. Teluk paling anti pada ayat suci. Betul loh mas, saya nggak mau. Hebat. Padahal Anda tahu bahwa Teluk paling takut pada ayat suci. Kok malah tidak ada yang sembahyang?
Okay, I'm going to forward a little bit to where he's praying so I can show you the sort of split in visual and performative politics here, where you see his much more calm and slow and rational movements. This cuts to the Dukun who is the one who is teaching Susanna's character black magic. So the Kiai's naturalist approach is kept up until close to the end of the sequence. At that point, however, he begins to move and act in a way that is closer to the Dukun's techniques, a little bit like this, seemingly in order to inject his own prayers with a modicum of extra power. Doing so reveals that he too can manipulate the unseen in similar ways. If this risks polluting himself with the tactics and aesthetics of his enemy, the Kiai at least succeeds in temporarily defeating him. And I'm going to move on to the last clip here, which is where the conflict comes to a head, and there's a battle between the Kiai and Susanna and the Dukun. As you can see, the social and political stakes of the last clip's aesthetic split are broadened and made clearer, yet also more complex in this clip. The Kiai's followers in the village pray in the subdued naturalist manner that he previously did in the Musalla, while he himself steps into the magic-filled fray of the battleground just outside, which is dominated by ilmu hitam and the skills and aesthetics associated with Dukun. Accordingly, he moves in a much flashier manner, flipping over and over like a gymnast, while miraculously keeping his pechi from falling off his head. Despite this, he is still clearly positioned as the calmer and more rational combatant, while Mourni's and the Dukun's attack showcase techniques that exceed filmic naturalism, but are anchored in the real aesthetics of Dukun's. The narrative twist that is thrown into the final sequence also creates an interesting dyad or couplet between Kliwon and Mourni. Kliwon is the Kiai's name. Formerly flirting under assumed identities, they now realize they are in fact brother and sister, leading to Mourni's intriguing statement about Kliwon, but we'll get to that in a second. Here you can also see a lot of filmic versions of the kinds of techniques and bringing forth things from the unseen that Dadang also practices. And I would argue that the film form collaborates with these sort of splits in visual logic, showing things that are naturalistic, but mixing them with things that call attention to form and look sort of faked, but at the same time follow this logic of things that are faked are actually real or more authentic things from unseen spaces. And here you can see the sort of showdown between the different styles here with this triple intercutting between Mourni and Kliwon and the people praying inside the building. And again, Kliwon demonstrates an ability to really sort of manipulate the unseen in ways that are unusual for a normal Kiai, right? Or what is a normal Kiai is another question you would ask. And here again, the film mixes genres, at will, inserting melodrama into this very sort of action and horror-filled scene.
Yes,
I'm going to let this play out because there's a lot of interesting stuff in here that I want to talk about in a minute. I've edited it down so it's a little shorter, but I'm just going to let the ending play out.
Rupanya kau biang kali semuanya ini, Gendon. Jangan heran, Sabri. Aku datang untuk menebus kekalahanku. Bertahun-tahun aku sudah mempersiapkan diri untuk menghancurkan kamu. Berpuluh-puluh tukang teluh jadi guruku. Sekarang tiba saatnya kau harus menyerahkan jabatan lurah pada aku. Atau ku hancurkan seluruh penduduk desa ini. Natang, kau mencelakakan rakyat karena tidak memilihmu sebagai lurah. Dan kau mencelakakan keluargaku karena angkaran pun kamu ingin jadi penguasa. Sabri, sekarang kita selesaikan persoalan kita secara laki-laki. Kau yang patut jadi lurah atau aku? Persoalan jadi lurah sudah lama selesai. Jelas rakyat tidak akan memilih seorang bajingan sebagai kepala desanya. Sekarang urusan pihak yang berwajib dengan seorang pengacau yang harus dibasmi. Bajingan, kau yang harus dibasmi, Sabri.
Here again, you can see these sort of very constructed, unrealistic formal flourishes mixed in with continuity and naturalism. Classic ambiguous ending. I love that. So I'm interested in the sort of dyad that's created, especially in this clip, by composed of Murni and Kliwon. And this is underscored when she says, "Kau adalah kakakku sekaligus kekasihku." The unusual relationship this sets up is of a piece with how their paths in life have diverged and then brought them together again, and with how the film mixes together different visual logics and politics. Kliwon left when they were still very young to study Islam in a pesantren in Banten, West Java, while Murni ended up being taken under the care and tutelage of a dukun back home in East Java. The ilmu that she receives from the dukun, moreover, is not one single philosophy or technique, but the result of his own study with berpuluh-puluh tukang telu, as he puts it. So it's a conglomeration of things from all over the place. In the end, their very different skills and experiences create a sort of balance when they're brought together to fight Gendon, the dukun, and Murni's teacher. It appears quite clear that without both of them and their respective techniques, styles, and abilities combined, it would have been impossible to defeat Gendon. The form and visual logics of the film also reflect this conglomeration of otherwise supposedly distinct elements. It combines more realistic representations with obviously fake or over-dramatized ones, while juxtaposing naturalistic shots and continuity edits with eyeline matches and performative zooms, off-kilter framings, and wide-angle distortion. The latter elements call attention to the film as a result of formalized techniques that flaunt their own constructedness and fakery. The narrative shows the stakes of these spiritual and aesthetic splits not to be mere dramatization. The intersection of the seen and unseen is deeply entangled with the real politics of the film's world, ultimately in a conflict over the position of lura, or village head. A situation like this would of course not be unimaginable to most viewers in real life. Indonesian politics outside of the film are also frequently caught up in discourses and practices of spiritual power. President Suharto himself, who was of course then in power, a proponent of kejawen, is known to have frequently consulted with dukuns, perhaps indeed the lura in the film announcing that he was legitimately chosen by the rakyat and so will never be defeated by a greedy magic-wielding penguasa, was a veiled critique of the state of politics under the new order. But what the film also makes clear is that without Kliwon and Murni's concatenation of seen and unseen, Islam and kejawen, the rakyat's chosen leader would certainly have been defeated and possibly killed. The film's own dynamic combination of natural and formal and of disparate genres, styles, and religious politics reflects on the frequent combination of distinct perspectives and forms of representation in real life under the new order, something that continues until the present. Mas Dadang's skills, for example, are not only known around Sidoarjo and Jawa Timur. Politicians have sought his assistance from as far away as Jakarta and Kalimantan. Even without that, his practice and the collection of skills, techniques, and ilmu that constitute it are not easily separable from realities of daily life or politics. Like an artist, scholar, or filmmaker, Mas Dadang's work as a teacher and dukun is also embedded in an ongoing process of shaping and reshaping local perspectives on politics and power through forms of representation. In doing so, he combines Islam and other local beliefs in a way that is similar to the film's construction of a dyad from Murni and Kliwon. One important way that he signals this split/combination, I argue, is with his performance of combining disparate visual perceptual logics. His practice and philosophy, moreover, were not divinely received, but were forged, like those of Kliwon and Murni, through processes of study and discussion. He began to formulate them as a member of a group whose leader had been educated over the course of 20 years by living and studying in a series of Javanese pesantren. In each such school, Pak Soleh, the group's founder, became temporarily entrenched in a distinct religious philosophy and anchored in particular interpretations of Islamic and local texts. Following his decades of study, Pak Soleh began to impart what he gained through mastering and combining the perspectives of many pesantren. As one of the youngest members of Pak Soleh's group, Mas Dadang learned to dissect and analyze the Quran, closely scrutinizing its lines and verses in Arabic. Appropriately, the technique was not strictly for religious purposes, but was also deployed as a tool for rethinking the foundation of Pancasila, the Indonesian national philosophy, in the conception of a singular God. Dadang's father, who was also a member of the group, explained to me that the first of 5 key Pancasila principles, Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa, is normally taken to mean belief in the one and only God. When held up against the group's interpretation of the Quran, however, Dadang's father claims that when interpreted as one and only God, Tuhan Yang Maha Esa is a weak and underrepresentative theological foundation. God, they argue, quote, is not one because you can resist one, end quote. Rather, quote, God is something that does not exist as such, end quote. Meaning, not that God isn't real, but it means that God is unrepresentable in the realist or naturalist terms of humans. God is an entity that stands outside the logic of consciousness and of the visible. God is the unseen creator. In Pancasila, the official conception of God as one is not just a religious precept, but serves as an allegedly unassailable metaphor for the unification of a vast and impossibly diverse nation composed of thousands of islands and hundreds of distinct languages, ethnic groups, and worldviews. Most of them, however, are made eminently invisible in official processes of national representation. For Dadang and his colleagues, the heart of the problem lies in the rigidly singular conceptualization of God as the center of the national structure as a whole. Calling God one is for them akin to making God representable. As the context of their intervention implies, the nation and its theological core should likewise not be understood to be singular, continuous, or enclosed. If the nation is instead riddled with holes and paradoxes that far exceed the abilities of a particular individual or interest to fully comprehend or to demonstrate, to point these out is not to weaken the unity of the whole. To do so, in fact, imbues the nation with the real strength of unity and diversity, another of the 5 stila that can be understood to resist representation or understanding in clear, so-called natural terms. Such a unity, if viewed in all its incomprehensible complexity, might indeed seem unnatural and full of paradoxes. The fact that it is also undeniably real, however, is a source of strength, like the fragmented and ever-shifting but eternal power of the geographic archipelago on which the nation is inscribed as Tanah Air. Even if politically unified, it is never one and has no clear beginning or end. Mas Permadi's use of a specific formal technique thus focuses attention not only on the emergence of an object. The seemingly contradictory flourishes also reflect the historical development of diverse local methods and politics of representation, including but not limited to cinematic representation. Like Dadang's aesthetic techniques, many of these modes share an underlying goal of encompassing multiple and often mutually contested perspectives, myths, epistemologies, or truths within a loosely identifiable worldview and mode of expression, but a very fragmented one. In every case, the unseen cannot really be shown, but by using techniques that constantly challenge the prominence of a singular visual logic and spatial logics, the Hollywood-esque idea of reality or the universe as a comprehensible unity is always already interrogated and subjected to critique. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Let's give applause to the great presentation from Mr. Doug Inferson. Well, audience, now it's time for the question and answer. And you may raise your hand or directly speaking here. Or you may write down on the chat box if you are in the Zoom. Don't forget to state to whom your question is. Okay, so while waiting for the questions, I just want to highlight some of the points that Mrs. Dr. Doan Omran has presented. She talks much about the post-colonialism ideas on the voice of the Muslim women writers. So there are many proofs, many evidence, many literary works that is written by women, especially the Muslim women around the world, and that shows that there are a kind of movement for the Muslim feminists to show and to strike back in the Homika Baba's theory. They say that women strike back to the imperialism. So I think that's some of the highlights of the Muslim women writers that show their existence and show their struggle in this world by writing down in their literary works. And Mr. Doug Inferson has talked much about showing the unseen. Some of my friends text me. He said that, what is he talking about? Is he talking about, I thought he was talking about politics or something. And then he was surprised that you show us the old films in Indonesia. Most of us here, the young generation, are not familiar with the old films, and that's interesting because in that films there are many aspects interrelated each other between the aesthetics, the logics, and the politics, the reality and the surreality. The idea of reality is related with theological things, theological foundation of their action. And it's interesting because it is presented in the films that we can get the real example of what it means. Okay, so is there any questions from you? Silakan.
Boleh.
Yeah. Okay, just go right away. Yes. Okay, silakan.
Sorry, Indonesian language ya?
Okay, it's okay.
Assalamualaikum
Silakan bahasa
warahmatullahi.
Indonesia boleh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam.
My name, nama saya Dikrul Hakim Tafusi Muiz, jurusan Magister Sastra Arab. Oke, yang ingin saya tanyakan terkait postkolonial. Mungkin yang menjawab mungkin nanti tergantung finalis bagaimana enaknya menjawab. Terserah siapa yang jawab lah intinya. Yang saya tanyakan adalah apakah di era digitalisasi itu terselubung hal kolonialisme yang berujung pada imperialisme, yang mana kita tahu bahwa batas-batas kenegaraan sudah tertembus oleh digitalisasi dalam bentuk transaksional, baik ekonomi ataupun secara kependudukan, sehingga gampang sekali untuk perpindahan penduduk seperti WNI menjadi warga negara asing, seperti negara Indonesia, warga negara Indonesia kemudian beralih ke negara lain, kemudian menetap di sana dan menjadi warga negara sana. Nah, dari sini apakah masih relevan ketika kita menyebut imperialisme digital seperti itu, sehingga banyak hal-hal yang berkolonialisasi berupa tadi penjajahan secara material bukan secara teritorial. Sekian.
Oke, terima kasih. Namanya Mas siapa?
Hakim.
Mas Hakim. Oke, terima kasih Mas Hakim. So the questions from Mas Hakim is there a kind of implicit colonialism in our digital eras? He talked about the borderless era in our digital era nowadays. People are liable to go borderless. Like maybe Dr. Doan Omran has been from Egypt, has been in the United States of America, and people relatively freely to go from one country to the other country. And he asked about, is there any implicit colonialism in that process of digital era, in this digital era? Maybe Dr. Doan Omran, please, you may have comment for this question.
I think she's still muted.
Yeah, the host has muted me. I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, very good. So I feel I was reading a short story with my students last week. I don't remember the title, but I know so the whole thing was about, I think technology is sort of colonizing us all. It's not just like one nation over the other, but I think like technology is controlling us all. If I'm getting the question correct, it's controlling all of us, but especially like with the Arab nations, I think like technology played a very important role during the Arab Spring. You know, because without technology, the Arab Spring wouldn't have happened. People, at least in Egypt, where I'm from, used to do the gatherings through using Facebook and Twitter. That's why Facebook was down in Egypt during some days of the Arab Spring. I'm not sure how that is related to women, but I think like women, Arab women and Muslim women are using technology somehow to become more seen, more Arab women nowadays. So like this is the positive side of it. More Muslim and Arab women nowadays are having blogs, Facebook pages, and they advertise their works there on Facebook, Twitter, easier to reach out to writers through social media. I invited one of the writers to Susan Abul Hawa. I asked her to come and give talk to my students for a class that I'm teaching on Arab women, conflict and resistance. So there's always these two sides. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Mas Doug, you want to give an answer also.
Okay. So there's been talk of kind of media colonization for a long time, certainly long before the digital era. And that's partly what I was addressing in my talk, was the idea of media colonization through cinema, and how much influence Hollywood and Hollywood form, Hollywood's way of making films, as well as the technology, the film itself, which we're often seen as Western oriented and sort of exported around the world by the West, are seen to have had this sort of very strong effect on how people represented themselves and conceived of their own identities and things like this. And certainly there's a lot of discourse of mimicry in there, as Dr. Omran was talking about the concept of mimicry. You know, often it's thought to be, especially at first, a kind of a direct mimicry that signifies a kind of a more colonized mindset, one that takes the colonizer to be this sort of great power that needs to be imitated and not just sort of learned from in your own way. And I think that's actually more complicated than it's often presented, the process and the effect of the cinema technology on the world and on the global South. Certainly, I think it is much more complicated in Southeast Asia, and that's part of what I was talking about, is how, you know, Southeast Asian circulations and discourses of film, and how they were very strongly related to local theaters and vernacular theaters and traditional arts, who shared a lot of the same audiences with films, with locally made films, made for a separate circulation that wasn't unaffected by Hollywood, but Hollywood was placed at a much greater distance. It was able to, you know, use this kind of unusual situation in the region to have a very different relationship with Hollywood. Hollywood still had a strong effect. It still kept local films out of certain kinds of theaters because of its strength in the market, but it also, they kept each other at a distance in a way that you know, made for much less direct imitation and much more sort of playing around with the tropes of Hollywood and mixing them with other forms. I think the digital revolution and the effect of digital technology and digital media on the world has played out in a similar way in Southeast Asia, and certainly in Indonesia, where you can see the way people use it is very much, you know, developing and drawing on these other sort of ideas of what you do with media. And the way that sort of global tropes and global genres and global films and signs and media are, global mass media are, you know, taken in. They're not imitated, they're often referenced, but they're referenced in a sort of a way that emphasize it as something foreign, but at the same time kind of, and acknowledges its power, but at the same time mocks it, almost always. And you can see this, you know, if you look at YouTubers, there's amazing YouTubers in Indonesia right now, and this is, you know, what that has changed is that kids with very little money can do this and get millions of views and hits, and are quite sophisticated in the way that they engage with globalization, especially. I mean, there's just thousands of examples of this. So, are we all being colonized by you know, digital media and by social media and things like that? In a way, yes, but the effect is complicated, and I don't think. And I think actually, you know, Southeast Asia is complicated. Its development and history are complicated, but it's, to my mind, has always been in an interesting and strong position vis-a-vis globalization and media. And this is, you know, some of what I was actually trying to get at in my talk, is to show connections between these different spheres and how they relate to representation. To briefly answer the person who texted Mundi, I mean, it's old Indonesian films are more and more accessible now. Lots of them are restored and on television or streaming services. This one I took from YouTube, and it's a nice restored version. The whole thing's on YouTube right now. I don't know if it's legal, but it's there. I downloaded it from YouTube. And so these films are coming back. It's not everyone is looking for them, and some people are still sort of surprised that people pay attention to them, but they were extremely popular when they came out, and lots of people still know them. And so I think they still have an important effect, an important potential, to think about the past as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for Dr. Doan Omran and Dr. Doug Inferson. Is there any more question? Yes. Okay, because our limited time, I will choose only 2 questions, yeah? 2 questioners. Okay, the first for Bu Ulil, and then the second for, okay, Mbak yang di sana. Okay, Bu Ulil first.
Okay, thank you. Selamat pagi, Mas Dag. Would you say so? Yeah. All right. It is very interesting presentations and research. I think that I never even think that you can investigate the practice of perdukunan in Indonesia. It is kind of interesting. Yeah. Okay. And my question is, do you also investigate the current movie in Indonesia? Because the practice of perdukunan and also the politics and in the relation of the politics, it also happens today. Not only in the not only happens in the politics, but also in the politics of even in the football. They also use perdukunan as well. So. Yes. I'm wondering whether is there any movie that can capture that kind of reality in our society like that? If you also put attentions on the current movie, so is there some kind of manifestations between the old movie and into today's current movie? Okay, that is my questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bu Ulil. The second question, please, Mbak.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sofia Junior. I'm from 5th semester in majoring English literature. My question is almost the same as Ma'am Ulil. What makes you interested in researching unique things that exist in Indonesia, especially on the island of Java, such as perdukunan, Ratu Ilmu Hitam, and Batu Aki? Even myself as a Javanese people, but I do not think to research this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Junior. So the questions is from Bu Ulil and from Mbak Junior, talking about the practice of perdukunan, and is it any evidence for the contemporary films or anything? And Mbak Junior's question is why? What makes you interested in that phenomena? Okay, Mas Dag. Okay, time is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yes, definitely there are contemporary films that deal with the same kind of splits that I'm thinking about. The reason I used an older film is because the aesthetic split between naturalism and construction is much clearer than especially with a lot of newer horror films. And also, there are starting to be some very good, interesting, sort of politically relevant horror films now. But for a while after Reformasi, during, from 1998 until 2010 or a little more than that, there weren't that many interesting horror. There's a lot of horror films, they're interesting in a different way, but there weren't horror films that were engaged in such a deep way in sort of politics. There are now. One of them I'm sure you've heard of is Pengabdi Setan and Pengabdi Setan 2. I haven't seen the second one yet, I've seen the first one. it does, it's much more naturalist in its style, even though there are some flourishes that you can relate with older Indonesian films. Obviously, it's a remake of a 1980 horror film called with the same title, Pengabdi Setan, which does have many more of the kind of flourishes I'm talking about. But one of the interesting things about Pengabdi Setan now, the new version, is that, the split between the Kiai and, the Kiai who supposedly comes in and rescues the people from their spiritual problems, is that it takes this up it takes this trope up, it brings it up only to smash it. Where the Kiai in Ratu Ilmu Hitam needed help, and in fact needed a woman to help him out with black magic to defeat this dukun. The Kiai in Pengabdi Setan, if you've seen it, the new version, he basically can't do anything. He comes in and tells them to pray, and the ghost laughs at him and makes him fly off. So there's a very different relationship between prayer and other discourses of power and manipulations of the unseen, to the point where the manipulation of the unseen and the perdukunan or the kedukunan part is much more, seems to be much more powerful, at least at certain moments. And there's a line in the film that says, before the nation and before Islam, there's this other practice and this other discourse in these groups, and they have a different kind of power. And that sort of implies that they're also more powerful. And that's part of what the film shows. And it's interesting because it's a very, very popular film, and this doesn't seem to bother people that this split is brought up, and actually brought up in a more uneven way, even though we can see in the public sphere that a more sort of conservative version of Islam is also really coming to the fore and, making its mark on media and making its mark on public consciousness. So it's interesting that there are these very sharp splits that continue to go on. So that's one example, and there's lots and lots of examples of media that use unreality and destroying naturalism, not just horror films, but, you could think of a TV show like Opera Van Jawa, right, which is premised on completely breaking apart the idea of a kind of a consistent naturalist world on screen. They destroy the sets in front of you, they throw them at the audience, and this is something that is also, very much accepted as a local form of representation that works, right? It's a hugely popular show that went on for decades, right? And until very recently, I think. So yes, very much so. And of course, there are still dukuns, Mas Dadang is still practicing. There's lots and lots of other ones. I see them all the time. Why am I interested in that? One, I just find it interesting. I mean, there's complicated reasons, but I set out to study mass media and cinema in Indonesia and then in Southeast Asia, and looking into it and looking at how people viewed it and looking at what the influences on local cinemas were, you very quickly get into spheres of traditional artistic practice or other kinds of artistic practice that are more local, and some of which have been around for a long time, and also rituals, because those are often, if they're not the same as rituals, they are related to rituals. Sometimes they're performed in ritual context. And so you get quickly led into these other spheres that you can, if you look at them in a certain way, they have a lot of effect on mass media representation and the discourse of mass media, what we call screen cultures, things like that. And a screen cultures as such have been around for a long, long time in Southeast Asia. If only because of shadow play, which is a huge thing and is still a huge thing in Java, certainly. So I think I became interested in these things. The best way to explain it is because it relates so strongly. I discovered that it relates so strongly to mass media.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's all for our question and answer for this session. And now, before we end this session, I would like to ask for the last comment or the last remark for this session. Please, Dr. Doan Omran, would you please give the concluding remark for this session?
The concluding remark for my paper or
yes,
for the session?
Yes, for your paper.
Yeah, okay. So actually, I talked today about books, the books and the special issue we did for Muslim women. We did so far I have co-edited 60 articles and book chapters for my work. And I think there is more work to be continued with the writings of Muslim women because unfortunately, since we're talking about media, Muslim women are always stereotyped for being, negatively stereotyped for being inferior mentally and intellectually, racially sometimes. And I think giving voice to Muslim women is a timely task that scholarship worldwide really needs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's give applause to Dr. Doan Omran.
Thank you.
And the last remark from Doug, Mas Doug Inferson, please.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll draw a little bit of a relationship between my paper and Dr. Omran's paper. There's other important aspects to what I'm talking about. One of them has to do with gender. And certainly Susanna's character in this film, who identifies as Muslim, even though she also practices tulu or black magic or, perdukunan, is a Muslim woman who shows herself to be very strong and able to eventually wield these practices of manipulating the unseen in order to defend herself, in order to fight for a certain cause in this village as well. And although it doesn't say so directly, it's pretty direct about juxtaposing the fact that the Dukun said, let's do this as a contest between laki-laki, a contest between men. And in fact, it isn't a contest between men. It ends up in a contest between Kliwon and Murni and him, in fact. And it's not able to be solved as a contest between men. That whole attitude of a contest between men is something that sees the world in a much more limited and less fragmented manner. It sees the world as sort of power flowing from one point, where in fact the discourse of this film is demonstrating that power can come from different points and different kinds of points and be based in different kinds of points. And that is something that is very much applicable to feminist practice, which doesn't always call itself feminist practice, but it can effectively be feminist practice.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give applause to our great presenters today. And I think that's all for our session. And thank you once again. Thank you very much for Dr. Doan Omran and for Dr. Doug Inferson.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. And I give the time back to the Master of Ceremony.
Oke, baiklah. Terima kasih kepada Ibu Mundi sebagai moderator pada plenary session untuk yang pertama ini. Tepuk tangan lagi sekali lagi teman-teman. Terima kasih juga disampaikan kepada speaker kita ya. Ada Mas Doug Inferson dan juga Doan Omran PhD. Terima kasih sekali lagi dan kita selesai dalam acara plenary session 1 ini dan kita akan break dulu ya teman-teman. Kita break dulu dan kita akan kembali lagi untuk sesi-sesi berikutnya ke ruang-ruang paralel. Dan ruang paralel sesuai dengan jadwal yang sudah di-share kepada seluruh panitia ya dan juga kepada seluruh peserta. Untuk paralel akan ada 4 ruangan ya. Betul ya, Bu Leli ya? Ya, ada 4 ruangan dan pembagiannya sudah sesuai jadwal yang dibagikan. Tidak mungkin kami bacakan karena ini banyak. Kita break mulai lagi sampai dengan pukul sebentar.
10:10 sekarang udah 10:48, berarti kita kumpul lagi jam 11. Nggak apa-apa ya, boleh jam 11 dimulai ya untuk paralel. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Pengumuman untuk teman-teman yang mau melihat ke paralel, ruangan-ruangan paralel boleh ya, silakan karena sudah dimulai paralel session. Ada di meeting room lantai 2, ada juga di ruang dosen lantai 1, ada juga di laboratorium 2, ada juga di SAC. Nah, jadi ada 4 ruangan ya. SAC ada di lantai 2, meeting room lantai 2, kemudian ruang dosen lantai 1, lab 2 ada di lantai 2. Silakan teman-teman mau bergabung, mau menimba ilmu kembali di paralel session. Dan nanti paralel session akan berakhir di 11:40. Nanti kembali lagi ke sini pukul 14:30. TET. Terima kasih disampaikan. Nanti ada plenary session 2 ya yang akan diisi oleh Profesor Dr. Wildana Wargadinata, Associate Profesor Dr. Istiada, Profesor Dr. Inyoman Dharma Putra, dan Pak Haryat Moko PhD dengan tema-tema yang menarik juga. Ingat ya. Kalau yang Pak Prof Inyoman besok, Pak Haryat Moko besok. Untuk yang hari ini Prof Wildan dan Prof Associate Profesor Dr. Istiadah 14:30. Terima kasih atas kerjasamanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Musik. Terima kasih. Udah di ya. Apa itu? Harusnya di share ya, Bu. Link Zoom. Ada yang online, ada yang offline. Boleh silakan mengajar. Nanti kesini lagi ya, 14:30 ya. Ya, 14:30 berarti ya, startnya jam 2 Om.
Recording stopped.